Shalom and welcome to the introduction study to 1 Peter, Sojourners with a Living Hope. The big picture view of what I think we will see is the lesson from 1 Peter. So a reminder why we're reading 1 Peter now. We've just finished 1 Timothy and Titus. These are letters written by Paul. It's believed after he was released from house arrest. So this puts the dating of these letters around 63, 64 AD. Paul has been released from house arrest. He's traveling around the Mediterranean, ministering, writing to the next generation leaders, Timothy and Titus. And it's believed that Peter is writing around the same amount of time period. The letter, it says, is written by Peter, which we'll look at here in a second. But another reason it's believed that Peter was writing at this time is because some of the statements he makes shows similarity and familiarity with some of Paul's writings. Specifically, Colossians and Ephesians, which you can see were written right before this, the so-called prison epistles, written by Paul while he was in prison under house arrest. So those were written around 60 to 61, which means Peter must have been written after that. But Peter couldn't have been written too late. This epistle, 1 Peter, couldn't have been written too late because the 3rd century historian Eusebius records Peter being crucified upside down during Nero's reign, which ended, as you can see down at the bottom there, around 68 AD. So looking at history, the thought process is that there was a great Roman fire that may have been started by Nero. The historians aren't quite sure who actually started the fire, but there's suspicion that Nero himself started the fire in Rome for his own purposes, to potentially rebuild the city according to how he wanted it, or to have the fame of blaming someone else for the fire, namely the Messianic community, the believers in Messiah Yeshua, took the blame and therefore exonerated Nero himself as the emperor. And so this started a series of state-sponsored persecutions of the Messianic communities in the Roman Empire. So it's believed that Peter's imprisonment and execution could have been in the wake of that situation. And if that happened between 64 and 68 AD, then potentially the writing of 1 Peter is right as these persecutions are beginning, 63, 64 or so. So you can pause the video and look at some of those details there. The setting, the historical setting of the book, let's start by looking at the author, whose name the letter bears. Peter, or Petras. He was also known as Shimon Kepha. Shimon obviously is a Hebrew name, comes from the familiar verb shema, to hear and obey. And Kepha is an Aramaic word meaning rock or stone. So that's the parallel to the Greek Petras, meaning rock. This person, Shimon Kepha, we remember is one of the 12 disciples. In fact, one of the inner 3 of Yeshua's disciples, with James and John. He ministered in Jerusalem, and going north along the coast, we read about in the early chapters of Acts. He's in Joppa, and then he is led in a dream, if we recall, to meet up with Cornelius in Caesarea, so north along the coast. He is a leader in the Jerusalem Council. We read about in Acts 15, a primary leader along with James, the brother of Messiah Yeshua, or Yaakov, his name would have been in Hebrew. And we're told by Paul that Peter did ministry along with his wife. So he was married and they did ministry together, presumably traveled together. The book of 1 Peter, it says in chapter 5, verse 12, was written through Silvanus, or Silas, he's also called in the scriptures, meaning that Peter could have dictated this message to Silas, who was his scribe and wrote the text down. It's possible, is what that means, through Silvanus. And the letter is addressed to several Messianic communities in Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, as we'll see on the map here in a second, encouraging them amidst this growing persecution, which was beginning to happen more and more in the Messianic communities. So in the middle of the map there, you can see the names of the regions of Asia Minor. These are mentioned specifically at the beginning of 1 Peter. These are the assemblies and this area, this region, Peter is writing to, addressing this letter to the assemblies in this region. Presumably that his letter would be passed around and shared with the communities there. As far as these other cities that I have starred and circled, we're going to read in 1 Peter that he says he's writing from Babylon. Now, scholars wonder if he's writing really from Babylon or potentially from Rome, but I just have these different cities, Rome starred with the red star up there on the left, and Babylon in Egypt. There was a site called Babylon there in Egypt with the yellow circle around it, and then Babylon, which is the more famous Babylon, where the children of the southern kingdom were carried into exile, is there by the Euphrates River in the Middle East there towards the right with the green circle. So what do I mean when I'm referring to Babylon and why there's confusion? Is it Rome? Is it Babylon? Not confusion, but differences of opinion about what Peter means when he uses this term Babylon. So let's look at the possibilities and some background regarding what the options are. Babylon at this time in the 1st century was a relatively small city, not the massive city associated with Nebuchadnezzar 600 years beforehand. That empire had come and gone, and now the Romans were the leaders of the known world at that time, and the city Babylon was a much less city of importance in the time of the 1st century when Peter would have been writing. But it was a center of Jewish culture. We know that the Talmud came from Babylon, that there was a large Jewish culture in that area and that remained in that area. So it's possible that Peter went to Babylon because we remember that he was called to the Jewish community, to the so-called circumcised. We read about in the gospel, Yeshua saying that he's going to send Peter to the house of Israel, is how it's put. And then also that Paul says that Paul was sent to the Gentiles, whereas Peter and James and some of the others their focus was more to the Jewish communities. So that would make sense that Peter might go to a Jewish center in Babylon. And the surrounding context at the end of 1 Peter chapter 5 isn't metaphoric. And so it's a little bit strange for him to suddenly throw in a cryptic word, code word, let's say, and not mean Babylon when he says Babylon. But this is what other scholars believe might be happening, that he's actually using Babylon as a code word for Rome. Because what would an audience think, especially a Hebraic or scripture-based audience, think when they hear the word Babylon? If we're familiar with the scriptures, the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and then the Ketuvim, the writings, or the so-called Old Testament, if we're familiar with the Holy Scriptures, then when we hear the word Babylon, we think what? Exile. We think the community that destroyed the temple. So in other words, one of the worst things that's happened in the history of our spiritual ancestry. So it can be thought of as a code word for your worst enemy. In this time period would have been Rome. This is the nation that is ruling the known empire, that has captured Israel, that is persecuting the Jewish people in general, but also the new Messianic community. And then there's revolts in Israel against the Roman Empire over the first couple centuries. So this could very well be a code word for Rome. And Peter may have used this code word Babylon to indicate Rome instead of coming right out and saying that Rome is the enemy, for instance. You may not want to speak of your captors that way, especially in a messianic community where we're talking about a king, a new king, the King of Kings, and a kingdom whose citizens we really are, we wouldn't want to inflame the situation necessarily. Could be why Peter used this code word. Some more evidence for that is later on when Yochanan, John, is writing the Revelation, he pairs Babylon with an imagery of 7 mountains, a beast on 7 mountains. And it's known that Rome was a city built on 7 mountains. So he's pairing Babylon with Rome. Rome is also called by the name of Babylon in this sense, in this metaphoric sense, in various Jewish writings. The text also says in 1 Peter that Mark sends his greetings. And we know from Colossians, Paul's writing to the Colossian community, that Mark was with him there in Rome, in the literal Roman capital there in Italy. As well as the early writers, the church fathers, and tradition over the first few centuries AD confirm and say that Peter was there in Rome towards the end of his life. So these are the different thought processes regarding the location Peter was when he was writing this letter. Who is Peter writing to? Who is Peter's audience? Well, he makes some various statements that may indicate a more Jewish audience and other statements that seem to indicate a more Gentile audience. So we'll take a look at those. At the beginning of the book, he describes those who are scattered. The Greek word is diaspora or diaspora, which was a very common term to refer to all of the Israelites who are scattered among the entire Roman Empire, to then call them aliens, meaning not in the land of Israel. You're aliens, you're sojourners, you're foreigners in these other lands. Could potentially be a Jewish audience. Also, he exhorts his readers to live honorably among the Gentiles. So could be, not necessarily, but could be that he's not talking to Gentiles if he's talking about living honorably among the Gentiles. But then he says things like, you should turn away from the futile way of your forefathers, that you were called out of darkness and into light. You once were a people, or were not a people, but now you are a people, and that they were being defamed and persecuted by their fellow countrymen for leaving idolatry. So all of these could make it sound more like a Gentile audience. And really, when you step back and look at it, it kind of makes sense that it's likely both, a mixture of Jew and Gentile in the Messianic community. Of course, why wouldn't it be? There is evidence all throughout the apostolic writings that there were both Jews and Gentiles coming to believe in the God of Israel through his Messiah, Yeshua. So Paul calls this believing community of Jews and Gentiles the Israel of God. Or we are called by Paul the seed of Abraham. There's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male or female, for we are one in Messiah Yeshua. And then Paul's imagery to the Romans of the olive tree, that we are, as Gentiles, genetically are grafted in to Israel, to the olive tree through Messiah Yeshua, and native branches, meaning Hebrew people who remain of the faith of the prophets of the God of Israel and belief newly revealed in Messiah Yeshua, they remain in, and those who are disbelieve for whatever reason are cut off, broken off. So this whole olive tree is the believing community, is the faithful ones, God's children, the Israel of God, so to speak. So it makes sense that the community Peter is speaking to, he would use language that is reflective of both. In addition, he uses a lot of Tanakh-based imagery, indicating that the people he is speaking to are the ones that are the prophetic fulfillment of what the stories and the instructions that God gave to his people Israel coming out of Egypt have been for and about the entire time. So he uses language like gird your loins, and that's a familiar phrase to someone with a Hebraic mindset from the Exodus story, how they're told to eat the Passover meal quickly and to be prepared, to gird their loins, to have their staff in their hand and their sandals on from Exodus 12. He says to be holy, for I am holy, which is a quote from Leviticus 11, words that Adonai is speaking to his people Israel, Jew and Gentile, there at the base of Sinai and in the wilderness. Peter says that the believing community, this community he is writing to, it has been redeemed with an unblemished lamb. That's very much Passover language, that we are to have clean hearts, that our hearts are purified according to his word. That sounds very similar to new covenant language in the prophets Jeremiah chapter 31 and the prophet Ezekiel chapter 36 about in the new covenant we're given a new heart, a removal of our heart of stone, a new spirit to then walk in Adonai's commandments and in his Torah and in his ways. These are characteristic of the new covenant community. And likewise, we are being built up into a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, which is very reminiscent of Exodus 19. Again, the community of Israel, a mixture of Jew and Gentile standing there at the foot of Mount Sinai. So always Adonai has wanted a believing community made of whoever will follow him faithfully, Jew and Gentile, starting from the beginning, obviously, but definitely at the birth of the nation coming out of Egypt at the Exodus. And he has always desired this community, and the believing community, there's always been a remnant continuing forward through the millennia. And at the revelation of Messiah Yeshua, it's no different. It's still going to be a believing community of Jew and Gentile who are faithful to the Messiah and all of the prophets preceding and the Torah, the foundation of Scripture. This is the faithful remnant that Adonai has desired from the beginning. So this is an epistle, and we read this every time to remind us what this literature is that we're reading. But now we're reading an epistle that's not being written by Paul, being written by another apostle. But still, it's from a leader to a person or to a community. And there are a few subjects that are addressed, but we are only getting really the leader's perspective. So we have to it's helpful to understand background and culture and the other issues in that time period that were happening to give us a little bit more context. So it helps us to understand this letter. When we don't have that historical background, sometimes there's things that are written in a letter that we may not understand the context to. So that's why we talked about the word Babylon that Peter uses, because that word indicate whether it's Rome or actual Babylon, still that word indicates exile. That word emphasizes that the people he's writing to have this feeling of not really being at home, not really being at their rightful place, or even in the location of their rightful citizenship. So that should flavor how we read Peter and his purposes in this letter. Also, this is during the time of the Roman Emperor Nero, who was notorious for persecuting the Messianic community, as history records. So that will also play into how we read Peter's words here in this letter written at that time. What I'm noticing as I've been studying the epistles in more depth is that, as I mentioned in the study with the Ephesians, the apostle often talks about the truth and doctrinal theological statements of truth and who we are and who God is first, or kind of as an underlying foundation, so that he can then make a point or make an argument for how followers and faithful ones should then behave. So I said the heavenly reality shapes our earthly behavior in every facet. So I think that's the same, and I'm seeing that in 1Peter as well. But to use the example from Ephesians, the famous passage in chapter 2, verses 8 through 10, because of our salvation, because of the salvatory work of Adonai in us, and we recognize the truth of his reaching out to us by his grace, we then obey. We then walk in his commandments. We then do good works through our faith. But it's predicated on our recognition of the loving grace that he has given us. So that's how the heaven reality shapes our earthly behavior. So let's talk about this theme that we see in 1 Peter, that we as sojourners in this world have a living hope. Well, I think this is based on recognition, the true recognition of our identity in Messiah, as was the case with a lot of Paul's writings, how he continually says in Messiah or with Messiah or by Messiah. Our identity in Messiah, Peter describes as us being redeemed, that we are born again, that we have a new life, that we have a salvation, an inheritance that's imperishable, that's waiting for us, that's ready to be revealed at the end times. So all of those are true, that are based in our identity in Messiah and what he has done for us. And we see that in 1 Peter, there are common words used. So if you look at this list here, what do you think the reason is that these words are used, and how all of these words can be related to our identity in Messiah and related to being sojourners with a living hope? Some of these words are quite different, but how are they all related to this primary theme of being sojourners with a living hope? Well, you see that suffering is mentioned most common 15 times in 5 chapters. That's quite frequent, but it makes sense when we think about our master, Messiah Yeshua. His suffering and his purposes in this world was really to come and give his life to serve the kingdom. So he suffered and gave up his life. Doesn't he himself say that we should expect that should be our expectation, that in the same way that he was persecuted, that we will be persecuted? Shouldn't that be our privilege as well, to partner with and participate with our master Messiah's purposes and plan? And therefore, it's our privilege to walk in the same way that he did and receive the same treatment that he did. So therefore, also by our lives proclaiming his purposes in this world, and not just following his example by being persecuted, but following his example in how we conduct ourselves while we are being persecuted, to walk as he walked in such a way, and to conduct ourselves in such a way with honor and grace and love in the midst of persecution, just as our master did while he was persecuted. Peter is sure to say that if you are being punished for your own sin, for things that you did wrong, there's really nothing to be honored about that. You shouldn't say, well, I'm being persecuted, when you broke the law in the first place and you're in jail because you broke the law. No, that is not persecution. That's you paying a debt for your crime. But if you are persecuted for righteousness' sake, then you can have this partnership with Messiah Yeshua because it's happening for his purposes. And what kind of purposes might that be? Well, purification, because trials serve as a sort of fire, a purifying fire, to remove the dross from our lives, to remove the things that are of the flesh, the things that are not of the kingdom, that are not of Adonai. Trials have a tendency and an ability to purify us in that way. They also have the ability to strengthen and grow our faith if we stay faithful in the midst of them. And if we walk in Messiah's example, if we demonstrate humility, and if we bless instead of curse, and don't revile when we are reviled, then going through trials and persecution is a witness to Adonai, to his kingdom. It's a witness of his love, which overcomes evil with good. So in that way, we are a witness during persecution, all of which are for his purposes. So our heavenly reality shapes our earthly behavior. What we believe about ourselves as sojourners on this earth and having a living hope will then shape and will then produce a certain type of behavior if we really believe these things. So I thought this graphic was helpful in seeing how this is kind of a cycle. It kind of just continues in a positive feedback circle. So if we have the hope of being glorified, of having a salvation that's ready to be revealed at the end of time, that we are just sojourners on this earth, that this is not our ultimate home, and this life is not the end of our life, that there is something afterwards that's to be had for those who are in Messiah. If we have this hope, then we will live in such a way. And how will we live? Will we conduct ourselves in reverence towards the one who gave his only son to be killed and sacrificed to pay the price for our sin? Will we respect him and, to use the word fear or revere, fear the one who can destroy not only the body, but also the soul in hell for all who betray him and all who turn against him and live their lives in defiance of him? He is a consuming fire, the author of the book of Hebrews says. So will we conduct our lives in such a way out of reverence for him, and therefore walk in his ways, follow his commandments, do as he says, partner with him according to his mind, his heart, his frequency, his movement? Are we going to be faithful to him because of this truth and the hope that we have in Messiah Yeshua? So therefore we live a life of holiness. We are holy as he is holy. That's the way we are to conduct our lives, which is what Yeshua Messiah did. So we imitate our master Messiah by walking in humility, first towards Adonai, humbling ourselves, being submissive to him. And then we walk in humility in relation with other people, the people in this world, which really sums up the two greatest commandments of love. We love Adonai by submitting to him and walking in his ways and obeying his commands. And then we love people by making ourselves less and lifting them up and putting their needs ahead of our own even, or to love them as we love ourselves. So both are postures of humility and submissiveness, not of rebellion. We're not rebels. We're not to rebel against. We are to not be hard-hearted. We are not to be stubborn. We are to be malleable. We are to be loving. We are to be humble. We are to make ourselves less that others are more. That's really what love is. So there is a time to when we are asked to disobey God's commandments. Of course, we have to be stubborn in our faithfulness to Adonai, but we are not to be characterized by rebellion otherwise. And this is coming from Peter, who's speaking to a Roman community under the Emperor Nero, to make such statements about honoring the emperor and things. So we live lives of holiness and walk after our Messiah, Yeshua, so that when we are persecuted, when we are denigrated and reviled, that we endure with joy. Why? Because just as our Master Messiah did, we have the kingdom in mind. The author to the Hebrews says, "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of majesty." In the same way, for the joy set before us, for the hope that we have of being in Messiah and being glorified, we also endure, just as our Messiah Yeshua did. Amen. May Adonai bless you in the reading of 1 Peter. Shalom.